For the second time in just a few weeks, shoppers have been forced to take refuge at Northland Shopping Centre in Melbourne.
For the past few weeks, Northland's been a bit of a war zone. Fires, fights, machetes, Land Cruisers, Nazis, sort of the epicenter of everything wrong with Victoria right now. It's also rekindled some discussions and debates around the criminal justice system, particularly around bail reform, as it was found out that all of the people involved with the recent stabbing were in fact out on bail, and at least one is out on bail right now. Does this mean that we've gone too soft on crime, that we need to toughen up? Well, it's complicated, and part of the reason why we're here is that we kind of put crime into this one little box that's separate from the rest of society and government responsibilities, and this may upset some people, but hear me out for the video. Being tougher on crime just reinforces that box that separates crime from everything else that we need to talk about. And so while the current approach to the Victorian government's pretty shocking, there's no redeeming qualities there, we should try to look at this a bit more holistically. On the 25th of May, a group of 10 young men between the ages of 15 and 20 got into an altercation, resulting in one of them being stabbed with a machete. A few weeks later, on the 18th of June, a 27-year-old man drove through the shopping centre whilst trying to evade police. Luckily, no one's passed away from these, nor the numerous other surrounding events. These events epitomise the recent upward trend of crime in Victoria, rising by 15% over the past year. However, this spike in crime is overwhelmingly driven by property and deception offences, and not crimes against persons, suggesting that the upward trend is much more directly linked to the current growing cost of living pressures. Now, lots of people aren't particularly receptive to arguments like this, saying things like, well, I'm having a tough time right now and you don't see me stabbing people, or it doesn't matter what they go through. If you commit a crime, you have to face the consequences. In my experience, the most common response to headlines and newsreels about crime is the call for tougher bail laws, more police powers, and harsher sentences. We saw this in Queensland, where a common slogan of the previous election was adult crime, adult time. Even here in Victoria earlier this year in March, the relevant Minister Anthony Carbines rushed through what he touted as Australia's toughest bail laws. And it's very understandable why people have such visceral or harsh reactions, because these crimes hurt real, innocent people. But if we're going to be grown-ups, we can't let our emotions purely guide how we think about potential policies. People's emotions should inform how we design policy, but it shouldn't dictate how we do things. Now, you could argue that the people who commit these crimes don't deserve shit, that they're horrible people. Why are we even considering their well-being? That moral outrage is irrelevant to what's effective at keeping people from committing crimes, which is what we should be concerned about. Sometimes I think we lose track of what we actually want. People get so caught up in the justifiable or not vindictiveness and righteous revenge that they forget what the actual goal is. And so when we look at the evidence of being, quote, tough on crime, it doesn't check out. This is available in the literature. Younger adolescents have higher probabilities of further incarceration after entry into the criminal justice system, meaning if you lock up or restrict the ability for young criminals to access bail, you're actually making it more likely for them to reoffend later in life as adults, what's called recidivism. According to Black 2016's meta-analysis, incarcerating juveniles is not a deterrent for criminal behavior, and rather, incarceration increases recidivism. But you don't even need the research to back this sort of thing up. You just need to think about it, and it makes sense logically if you think it through. If you have a troubled kid who didn't have the best upbringing, who lives in a deprived neighborhood, there's a significant likelihood of them getting involved with people or situations where they're prone to be influenced into committing crime. You put them in the criminal justice system and it's all they're surrounded with, it's all they know, and all these sort of surrounding insecurities and anxieties, whether it be financial or mental, remain unaddressed. Obviously then later in life, they're going to end up back into that same system. Now, I can't believe this has to be said, but not everyone who grew up poor goes on to be a criminal, obviously. Without fail, you'll always have people who obtusely object by saying, well, I grew up in a shit environment and I'm not stabbing people. Obviously, it's not that simple. Everyone is socialized differently. No one has the evil gene or the good gene. Often the slightest differences in upbringing, which sometimes can be just dumbed down to luck, can make the biggest differences. To those overly deterministic people, Do you think that your life would be the same if you did or didn't grow up with your parents, the school you went to, the friends you have or didn't have, teachers, mentors, money, your job, a predisposition towards a particular illness, the city you grew up in, the infrastructure surrounding you, all this stuff? One way or another, in positive and negative ways, these are the things, our environment surrounding us, shape who we are, depending at what point in our lives they come into contact with us. If we understand that, then it's very easy to understand that being tough on criminals is actually quite counterproductive, particularly when we're talking about youth crime. When you start treating young people like they're criminals, and you don't seek to address all this surrounding stuff which shapes them into who they are, and instead you try to retroactively punish them, it fixes nothing. If anything, it's a great injustice on the part of the government for not giving these kids the best possible shot at a dignified life, and most of all, for failing the victims of these crimes. Again, it's not necessarily about feeling sorry for anyone, it's looking for the best and most effective policy in combating crime. Logically speaking, combined with the evidence, it is crystal clear that retroactively punishing criminals with harsh sentences is completely ineffective policy. And if our goal is to make sure that the lowest amount of people committing crime as possible, then we shouldn't be doing it. When you say these things, saying that we shouldn't be tough on crime, a lot of people will hear that we should just do nothing, and that's sort of the approach the Victorian government has adopted over the last decade. Criminal justice reform can't be put into this box isolated from the rest of policy decision making. So what is an otherwise decent policy of remand as a last resort is sort of swept under the rug, as the actual root causes of crime aren't addressed. Just because we aren't doing a bad thing doesn't mean that there are good things that we need to be doing. There's also this impression that Victoria is soft on crime, and with very few exceptions such as that remand policy, this is just not the case. Victoria has been outstripping spending of other states on police and prisons, and has been jailing people at levels not seen since the 19th century. Compared to other states, Victoria is heavily policed, with the highest per capita police numbers on the eastern half of the continent. In fact, the growth in spending on criminal justice has far outstripped the spending on that on education and health. This isn't even to mention the government's abysmal record on low-income housing, building just 300 public homes in a decade of being in office. This has meant that Victoria has the lowest proportion of social housing compared to the rest of the stock in the country. The residential care system is also just terrible, as the Victorian government spends the lowest per capita on care services for children. Basically, resi is where kids who don't have functional family lives go to stay, and there's often a big overlap between kids in residential care and kids in the criminal justice system. 2/3 of kids in resi have had contact with the justice system. Furthermore, kids are being criminalized within the actual homes, as consequences of mental breakdowns like throwing plates and even self-harm are being reported to the police. And in fact, it's often once they're in this system where these kids are exposed to criminal organizations, which seem particularly appealing given the otherwise subpar services provided at resi. According to Victoria's Commissioner on Children and Young People, there is no doubt that there are networks of predators who are organised, who understand where residential care homes are, who understand how vulnerable the children are in these homes, and target those homes and target those children. So by virtue of relegating all these responsibilities to the criminal justice system as opposed to a more holistic approach including education, housing, health, etc., the Victorian state is socialising vulnerable children into becoming criminals, which it then scapegoats as a means to bolster the criminal justice system, using victims' grief as pretext and perpetuating this cycle. It's pretty cynical stuff. And of course, we have to note that First Nations children face a disproportionate level of suffering and abuse within the criminal justice and care system. An Auditor General report stated that the DFFH cannot be assured that it is providing timely, safe and stable placements for First Nations children and young people at risk. In describing how crime is a cyclical, intergenerational phenomena, sociologist Shireen Hamilton says that arbitrary decision-making processes highlight how ruling ideologies reproduce subordinate relationships and subsequently marginalize an Aboriginal parent and her children, in this case over at least 3 generations. Serving to compound the injustices within the system, many of the parents and families that community workers worked with had intergenerational involvement with the child protection system, where they experienced a form of intergenerational marginalization. So clearly we have a very hodgepodge patchy system where it's lenient in very specific ways, but also incredibly punitive in other ways and debilitatingly dysfunctional where it arguably really matters. Why are we at this point and what can we do to fix this? In my opinion, the Victorian Labor Party has never had a serious, coherent and cogent strategy on crime. It's always been on the fly, based on the vibes, based on what the tabloids are reporting, based on the election, based on this advisory council, etc. The police union, for instance, is one of the most influential in the state, for example, helping the government devise the SAM police recruitment scheme, which was found to be in breach of the government's data quality standards. This of course didn't stop the government from using it to fund the police. You had the remand as a last resort principle, which was recommended to the government by a coronial inquest, but as mentioned, was removed as a consideration by the most recent tranche of legislation after media backlash. So there's no sort of guiding philosophy, big coherent framework behind what the government does in relation to criminal justice. There's not a lot of coordination with other departments, and they're essentially just opportunistically selecting who's got the loudest voice proximate to them. So if we're actually serious about tackling crime, we need to exclude the voices and powers which have an interest in wanting a punitive justice system. A wide range of experts must be brought in, from criminologists, sociologists, and economists who have done the research on what's most effective and what's not a good way to go. Of course, First Nations input must be binding. The current Euro Commission has little, if any, sway over the government. Fundamentally, however, the question becomes one about the principles by which we distribute resources in our society. Ultimately, if we gear our economy towards profit accumulation and real estate speculation, these more social questions of crime won't be solved. As put by economist David Hayward, Victoria is a rentier capitalist state whereby assets are deployed in markets involving little to no competition, with rents being extracted as a result. This is how we get massive multi-$100 billion infrastructure projects like the suburban rail loop, which hasn't been properly costed nor reviewed by the relevant bodies, but then also the lowest spending and attention towards public housing and care services for children. Victoria has become deeply enmeshed in networks of global firms whose strength is their expertise in bidding for contracts globally. Only once we break up the oligarchic stranglehold that this web of public and private elites have in our society and distribute resources according to need, not in favor of concentrated industry, will we really start to solve the issues surrounding criminal justice. Oh, and go into Northland without dying.